Let's see what's going on with the Islamic ideology in Australian politics.
Well, last year we revealed a clip I'm about to show you of Anthony Albanese in his younger years passionately condemning what he called Israel's occupation of Palestine. Now, as you can see, he yells into a microphone at a pro-Palestinian protest. Have a look.
The response of Israel has been to meet children throwing rocks with helicopter gunships, with tanks and with missiles.
Now, according to far-left news site Crikey, the clip that we broadcast was of Albanese at a pro-Palestinian protest during the Second Intifada in October 2000. And Anthony Albanese was not a student, but already a politician. Now, Crikey, coming at this issue from a completely different perspective to us on Sky News, ran a report on Saturday that Albanese attended that protest outside the US consulate and that both American and Israeli flags were burned. They reported, and I quote, "At Martin Place, where the US consulate was located at the time, a group of some 20 men broke from a 2,500-strong crowd of protesters and tried to storm the building," news agency AFP reported. Sections of the crowd chanted slogans calling for a pan-Arab jihad, or holy war, to push the Israelis out of disputed lands. Despite appeals from their leaders for calm, a group of about 50 protesters set fire to Israeli and US flags. The story added chants of free Palestine and God is great drowned out several speakers, including an Australian Member of Parliament. And they say that was Albanese. This is quite explosive because it explains why Albanese has been so reluctant to unequivocally condemn the aggressive protests we've seen. It explains why he didn't come out swinging in defence of the Jewish community after the Opera House protests on October 9, when, as you know, the mob chanted, "Where's the Jews?" and worse, and burned flags, while police told Jews to stay at home. And Jews were meant to be attending a vigil for the terror attacks at the Opera House that very night, with the sails lit blue and white. And now we learn that Albanese, as an MP, not a student, was at a protest during the Second Intifada where God is great was chanted and flags were burned. I've played this clip many times, but now Crikey has tracked down the protest where Albanese said it. Have a look again.
The response of Israel has been to meet children throwing rocks with helicopter gunships, with tanks and with missiles.
Now, Crikey reports that he attended more protests in the next few weeks. This is massive. The Second Intifada, where there were suicide bombings in Israel and serious threats to Jewish institutions in Australia. And Albanese was among the anti-Israel protesters. He was an MP at the time and made similar remarks in Parliament.
Palestinians must be given their homeland. The occupation of Gaza, the West Bank and East Jerusalem by the Israelis has created generations of oppressed people. While many Israelis continue to demonise all Palestinians as terrorists, Palestinians experience Israelis as occupiers and employers of cheap labour, interrogators and jailers. Meanwhile, the government...
That's lies. All lies.
The government of Israel continues to allow fundamentalists to build illegal settlements on Palestinian land.
Let's bring in now Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Paterson. James, I think this revelation is extremely significant. What do you think?
I completely agree with you, Shari. Most Australians probably assumed that the Prime Minister's response, inadequate response since the 7th October of rising anti-Semitism in our country, was just due to the fact that he's a weak Prime Minister. But actually, I think what you've demonstrated is that deep down he has hatred for Israel, a deep-seated hatred which goes back decades. And what we're seeing here is that secret hatred bubbling to the surface and manifesting in his policies today. I think he's the most anti-Israel Prime Minister we have ever had in this country, at least since the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. And no wonder he has failed to rally to the Jewish community in its hour of need. No wonder he's abandoned Israel at international forums and in public debate. And no wonder so many Jewish Australians feel so abandoned at this critical time.
Do you think this explains why he couldn't strongly and unequivocally condemn the Opera House and other similar aggressive and violent protests because he was at a similar protest where flags were burned?
Anthony Albanese's whole history as a politician is to appeal to extremists like the people you've seen at those rallies. He has been to those rallies, he's addressed those rallies, his policies and rhetoric seeks to appease the people who go to those rallies, and I think he deep down has a lot of sympathy with their perspective. Let's remember that in recent times, in fact, in just the last parliament when he was in opposition, he went all the way to the United Kingdom to spend time with Jeremy Corbyn and posted selfies with him on social media in the middle of the UK Labor Party's unprecedented anti-Semitism crisis. Keir Starmer is trying to clean up the anti-Semitism of the Jeremy Corbyn era and expel those people from the modern Labor Party in the UK, including Jeremy Corbyn. But Anthony Albanese thought it was a good idea to post smiling selfies with him. I mean, I think this really does show that extreme anti-Israel hatred that lies underneath the surface of these policies.
Okay, we're going to continue to cover this and investigate Albanese's past stories I first reported in the lead up to the last election. Now, Andrew Giles.
Joining me, Gemma Tonini, columnist and communications consultant, whose camera's just conveniently conked out, and Caroline De Russo, commentator and president of the West Australian Liberals. Caroline, still no answer why Liverpool Hospital disguised Rosalia Schickberg as Karen Jones. So who do you think the hospital thought might attack her?
Well, firstly, the faffing that we got from the Premier and the Health Minister today, it tells us that they probably don't really want to tell us what happened. What I'd be interested to know, Andrew, is what about all of the other victims? Some may have been in the same hospital, some may have been in other hospitals. Did this happen in other instances, or was this an incident that just occurred at this hospital? Because for me, Andrew, and I'm very happy to be wrong, but the irresistible conclusion is that whoever the hospital administration were didn't feel like that patient was safe being identifiably Jewish, which is no doubt terrifying for her, but quite frankly is terrifying for the rest of the Australian public. I don't buy the excuse about the media. That I'm sure that they can put measures in place to make sure that in relation to certain patients there's extra levels of security for anyone who inquires about them. I mean, you think about the privacy rules that we have, Andrew. Like if my mum wants to do something for me, she can't even do something for me, and what somehow the media is going to be an issue in relation to someone who's an inpatient at a hospital. I find that very difficult to buy. For me, at this point, and until I'm provided with a better solution, she's not safe. And if the hospital administration don't think a Jewish patient is safe in that hospital, then well, who knows?
Gemma, who do you think it's not safe from? Who do you think?
Sorry, Andrew, I missed that. Say that again for
me.
No,
that's what I said last night, but Gemma?
Yes. I mean, look, I was a working journalist for a decade and I specifically covered the health round when I worked for a commercial television network in Western Australia. The media excuse is it's a BS excuse. That is an absolute nonsense proposition. And anyone who's spent more than 35 seconds in a working newsroom of any medium will tell you that that is a BS excuse. So the questions that should be pursued are, why was it done? Who was it done by? Where was the documentation? And as Caroline rightly asked, were there any other patients in relation to Bondi who had their names changed who were at that hospital? It is an unacceptable explanation and it deserves to be prosecuted further. And I just feel like that answer was so far beneath a Premier who has up until now been pretty sure-footed on these issues.
Yeah, it is weird why we're not told specifically who.
Well, they're worried about Islam. Yeah, in this case it's anti-Semitism. The police should be called. Sorry, my volume was down. And that person needs to be guarded. But they changed the person's name but didn't bring any protection or security in. It's completely out of order.
Well, it's not weird. It's not weird. It's not weird. It comes to the exact point that former Prime Minister Morrison raised in his speech, tiptoeing around issues. You cannot deal with things unless you confront them and name them.
Caroline, talking about that speech of Scott Morrison, what do you think? The idea of having governments oversee and potentially themselves license preachers, Muslim preachers, or force Muslim institutions to do that?
Well, I think that the conversation that you had in the previous segment, hit the nail on the head. The fact of the matter is that the government is not going to just deal with one religion. They're going to deal with all of them, right? And that there just goes without saying. We've already seen this week, and no doubt that you've reported on it, the Israeli influencer who wasn't allowed to come into Australia because of, certain things that he'd said. And I'm like, well, why are we dealing with this, side issue? Yes, it's the same sort of idea and the same sort of legislation, but why aren't we dealing with the crux of the issue? Some Jewish influencer is not the actual practical problem that we're having at the moment. The fact of the matter is you're going to end up with government legislation that is going to be across the board unsatisfactory. And all religions are different. You know, I'm of the Catholic faith. You know, that's not going to surprise you at all. But there's already so much regulation and institution in the Catholic Church that keeps everyone on the straight and narrow. And look, I agree, certain things have happened in the past. It's an absolute shame on the Catholic Church. But there is already a lot of regulation there that governs the way that Catholicism is practiced in this country. Not necessarily every other religion is the same.
Now, Caroline, in the break you said, well, the big churches here, they do licence priests already, or ministers,
Former
whatever.
Prime Minister Scott Morrison has...
if I wanted to, I could set up my own Hillsong tomorrow. And the issue here is if the Muslim community, they don't have big church, big employers like that. They do it individually, and anyone can be a preacher. You can't impose that on them.
I think that was me, Andrew, but we often get mistaken for the same person, so we're quite okay with it, to be honest.
I thought I did say Gemma, sorry.
I could easily start a church tomorrow with the qualifications I've got, but I won't do it.
Look, it's true, and the point that I wanted to make was that Pentecostal churches, Catholic, as Caroline said, Anglican, there is already a system whereby ministers are licensed by the denomination. And look, you could probably set up your own church, Andrew. Good luck getting a lot of followers. The point is that the Christian denominations already have...
There's a challenge.
Yeah, exactly, you and me both. They already have processes in place whereby there is oversight, there is licensing, and there is regulation. Why wouldn't the Muslim community want to do that? Why wouldn't you?
It's not set up that way. The faith doesn't have that. They don't have the big churches.
Well, you don't have to be a big
Shia
church.
Orthodox church.
Sure.
Then it's just individual. Pick yourself.
Well, it's the
I think that
conversation
bishop
to be
got stabbed
had.
in the eye. I think he appointed himself. You know, that's the thing. It's the freedom.
He was a
why should it apply to any other
He was a Maronite Christian from memory. My point is, it's about you don't just let anyone teach your kid at school, do you? There's oversight over teachers, and it's the same
that's
concept.
consumer choice.
It's the same concept, but I think it's probably more time than we have for.
Got to go. Yeah, I'm afraid. Gemma Tonnini, Caroline De Russo, thanks to you both.
Former Prime Minister Scott Morrison has made a timely call for action to tackle Islamist extremism and anti-Semitism in the wake of the Bondi terrorist attack. Speaking at an anti-Semitism conference in Israel, Morrison echoed the reality that I've pointed out here for more than 2 years, that the warning signs in Australia were there immediately after October the 7th, 2023.
Within 48 hours of October 7, pro-Palestinian protesters gathered at the Sydney Opera House chanting violent anti-Semitic slogans. Regular protests followed in Sydney and in Melbourne over the next 2 years, culminating in an estimated 100,000 people marching across our Sydney Harbour Bridge alongside those calling for globalised intifada, death to Israel Defence Forces, the elimination of the Jewish state from the river to the sea, and even the display of portraits of Iran's supreme leader. As Ayaan Hirsi Ali observed of similar protests in the UK, many participants were compassionate people seeking peace, but they chose to march side by side with those promoting hatred.
And making another point that we've made here often, Morrison said that as well as doing too little to quell this hatred, the Albanese government's actions only made it worse.
At the policy level, the Albanese Labor government ended 75 years of bipartisan support for Israel by unilaterally recognising Palestinian statehood, a move praised by Hamas itself. In this environment, is it surprising that radicalised Islamists bent on violence convinced themselves their moment had arrived and that another Australian icon, Bondi Beach, should be the scene for their atrocity?
Rather than merely criticise, the former PM outlined a policy plan to tackle Islamist extremism, saying we need to learn from how Muslim nations combat radicalisation themselves.
Islamic leaders have a pastoral duty to protect their communities from radicalisation. And I believe most take this responsibility very seriously. However, stronger institutional frameworks would assist them, but it would also expose those who do not share their commitment. And it is time that the Islamic institutions in Australia adopted nationally consistent
A court has heard a reformed anti-Semitic vandal was so outraged by the Bondi Beach massacre, there are now concerns he could seek retribution for the terror attack. It comes as Mohammed Farhat fights to get out of jail, while authorities are fighting for strict supervision if he's released.
Long before Bondi, this hate-fuelled rampage in Sydney's Jewish heartland left our city on edge. Cars and businesses in Wallara sprayed with anti-Semitic slogans in November 2024. Mohammed Farhat pleaded guilty to the spree, claiming he was manipulated to carry it out in return for drugs and money. but a magistrate found it was inspired by religious and racial hatred. The 21-year-old was jailed for 1 year and 8 months.
Islamic ideology again in action.
Due for parole last December before authorities put a stop to his release. Farhat has a Hezbollah tattoo on his neck. The barrister for the state today arguing he's at risk of committing a serious terrorism offence if not kept supervised.
There's an understandable, I think, concern from the authorities, from the government, from the police, that we need to keep the community safe.
Farhat
hang on, they're saying, what I don't understand, viewers, is they're saying keep the community safe, but they're allowing the protests in Sydney again, and they're screaming out Intifada and from the river to the sea, which is the annihilation of the Jews. It's pure anti-Semitism.
Denounces what he did in Woollahra, also expressing sympathy and disgust about the Bondi Beach massacre. The inmate was so outraged by the terror attack, he allegedly said in a prison phone call he'd kill those responsible. These comments...
You know, he'll say anything now that he's in jail. We've been screaming just as normal Australian civilians to do something about it, and they're only gaslighting us still. They're still gaslighting us because the protests are still happening in Sydney and people are screaming out global intifada and from the river to the sea. Doesn't matter what this crim's saying in jail.
Sparking concerns Farhat could seek retribution for Bondi, but his legal team says it shows there's a complete lack of ideology. Farhat is fighting to get out of jail before his maximum term expires in October. Tomorrow he'll appeal the severity of his sentence. Tiffany Genders, 9 News.
Well, he's going to say anything, isn't he? That's a pretty stupid bit of reporting, to be honest.
Anthony Albanese's gross failure to act on anti-Semitism and his subsequent poor response to the Bondi massacre has been savaged by Australia's top law enforcement. And this is actually very scathing for Labor. Bondi could have been prevented, but thanks to what is being described as willful blindness, 15 families are grieving the loss of their loved ones who were murdered in the biggest terror attack on home soil in a deliberate targeting of Jews. A security insider has sensationally broken their silence in an opinion piece in The Australian called "Don't Swallow the Political Spin on Bondi Tragedy." Morgan D, an assumed name to protect their identity, is a high-ranking law enforcement professional with decades of frontline experience in Australia and overseas within the Australian Federal Police. They write today, government leaders now speak as though the terrorist attack at Bondi Beach came without warning, as if there were no signs, no escalating threats, no atmosphere of danger, as if it emerged from nowhere. And the repeated briefings, particularly to Foreign Minister Penny Wong and Home Affairs Minister Tony Burke from security agencies, all pointed to a growing and foreseeable threat. And then here is the real stinging line in that piece. There is a legal term for ignoring such warnings: willful blindness, when someone deliberately avoids knowing the truth so they can later claim ignorance. It is about accountability for choosing not to see what is in front of them. Willful blindness. And it was very clear from day one when Labor failed in its duty to crack down on anti-Semitism, instead delivered wishy-washy lines with no action.
I think it is always the right thing for Australia to urge restraint and the protection of civilian lives.
We condemn as a government any indiscriminate attacks and targeting of civilian infrastructure, including hospitals.
We have consistently said...
Yeah, including hospitals. We've just had a woman's name changed in a Liverpool hospital. It's come out after the Bondi attack to protect her from an anti-Semitism possible murder. I mean,
we wish to see de-escalation. We believe a wider regional conflict is not in the interest of any of the peoples of the region.
They never stopped any of the protests. They're still on the 29th of the 1st, 2026, a week ago, screaming out global intifada from the river to the sea in Sydney, and I believe other places as well. They're just gaslighting us.
Israeli or Palestinian, every innocent life matters.
Of course, what happened at the steps of the Sydney Opera House on October 9, 2023 should have been the number one warning. But Labor chose not to see what was in front of them because Muslim votes were more important than the safety of Jews and the safety for all of us, for that matter. And we know that willful blindness spiralled. Jews feared for their lives. Synagogues were firebombed. Businesses, schools and childcare centres were targeted. Hate was spewed. The Sydney Harbour Bridge was hijacked by protesters who chanted death to the IDF and waved flags of terror groups like Hamas. I could go on and on. But Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese were too preoccupied with recognising a Palestinian state and putting votes before values.
Well, joining me now is my panel, Sky News contributor Joe Hildebrand and former Victorian Labor Party President Michael Kroger. Welcome to you both. Great
Good
to
evening.
Have you with me.
Great to be here.
Michael, let me start with you. You're in Athens, I believe, but you would have heard Scott Morrison's speech. What did you make of it?
Well, look, I think there's a lot of truth in what Scott Morrison has said. As you correctly pointed out, we've vilified 1 million gun owners for the actions of 2. So, we have a problem with radical Islam in Australia and in the Western world. And that fellow, Pat Conroy, he's utterly delusional. So he's a captive, like the Labor Party is, unfortunately, to a massive number of Muslim voters in a number of inner-city Sydney seats, and he plays up to them. But we don't have a problem with the Hindus. We don't have a problem with other religions in Australia. We do have a problem with radical Islam preachers, hate preachers, demonstrations where we have terrorist symbols calling for the death of Netanyahu, death of the IDF. These are all coming from radical Islam supporters, and I think,
And this is still happening on a weekly basis in Sydney after the Bondi attack.
Scott Morrison, there's a lot in what he said which is quite relevant. We've got to do something in this country to stop hate preachers, to stop the murder of Jews on Bondi Beach, and Scott Morrison's put forward some very good suggestions. So
We've got to stop Islamic ideology in Australia.
I would hope the government and the opposition would treat what he said very seriously. Certainly was treated very seriously yesterday in Israel.
Joe, do you think Scott Morrison's comments will then open the door for this to be able to be discussed, or do you think people like Pat Conroy, the Imams Council, will succeed in having this discussion shut down and we'll all just move on?
Yeah, you have to be able to talk about these things, of course. It's an interesting question. So my understanding is that to become a sheikh in Islam, it's a much less formal process than, say, in the Catholic or Anglican Church, where there's official training, there's an official sort of curriculum, if you like, that you have to follow. You then have to be accredited as a priest or an Anglican priest or a deacon. Then
I can tell you right now, if you look just behind me, I've got the bottom ones covered up with the Aboriginal Unsettled publication, which was brilliant. But to get to the bachelor, the master's and the doctorate is an 8-year journey and tens of thousands of dollars. You'll see also there in the corner next to Jesus there with the rich man's son, the hospital course as well. You don't just go waltzing in, I can tell you now. So I don't know what system the Muslims have got. Doesn't sound too difficult. And even with all that training, even with all that education, I still don't feel that I was called to be a preacher in the sense of looking after the flock. I was more the prison outreach, street outreach type.
Priest, whatever. And that doesn't take place in Islam. Basically, as long as you can garner a crowd, and it's like a lot of Protestant, like a lot of Protestant branches, as long as you can draw a crowd to listen to what you want to say, that's fine. You're a preacher, and that's all you need to do. So maybe Morrison is calling for a bit more regulation. It's a bit ironic, given that his branch of Christianity is like that.
Well, I think his point was he was calling on.
No, his branch of Christianity is not like that. You just don't go waltzing into Hillsong and become a preacher. I can tell you that right now. You are completely put under a due process, and that's not to say some preachers don't fail, but you're put under due process. My daughter went to Hillsong to do the pastoral course for 12 months. It cost a fortune, but you just don't go waltzing into any of the Hillsong church. I look, with all my qualifications, I couldn't go just waltz into the Hillsong movement and become a preacher. There's no way in the world. It's too stringent. It's really governed and protected. No, that's not true what he just said.
Islamic leaders to regulate themselves. Government intervention would be a last resort, but I was depressed, as I said in my editorial, by the response.
I think it would be like...
The Imams Council, they shut him down and said he's being ridiculous.
So I think it would be like, almost restarting the Reformation. So it'd be like telling a Catholic priest, an Anglican priest, a Methodist, a Baptist, a Pentecostal, whatever, say, right, you just sort out what Christianity is and then come back when you're ready. So it's just, we should be able to talk about it, but you've got so many different people in a very unstructured way who have taught themselves, they might have studied with other scholars, taught themselves the Quran as they see it. And if you want to interpret the Quran literally, it can be an extremely violent book. And that, I think, is one of the differences to the Bible, that Islam, Jesus sort of conquered the world by allowing himself to be nailed to a cross and sacrificing his life. Muhammad, rallied great armies and took over all the people, took over all the cities that had rejected him and, smote all the people who had, questioned him. And that's all great as well. Plenty of religions and history has that narrative. But again, there's so many different parts of it that I just don't see how it would be workable. I think one of the reasons why Labor doesn't want to talk about Islam as much as others would like it to is because it doesn't want to make radical, murderous, fundamentalist Islamists think that is actually Islam.
I totally disagree with...
I can tell you right now that you can't be a Muslim without believing in jihad, a real Muslim, because the writings of the Quran or the Hadith or Syria or whatever you want to call it, one way or another you are going to have to contribute to the global jihad, and that's it. Other than that, you're really not a Muslim. You're something else.
With you on that.
That is what they think. I
don't think they're concerned about the thoughts of Islamists. I think they're concerned about votes and losing votes because
it's because like people like ISIS think they are the true Islam, right? And so if you say yes, all Muslims are the problem, then or Islam is the problem, then ISIS says, see, it is true Islam.
Okay, so Islam is the problem and the interpretation of it. Some Muslims can say, well, Christians follow the Old Testament and all that, which they're not supposed to. But the Jews, given the ferocity and the maliciousness and the cruelty of the Old Testament, the Torah and the rest of it, and Leviticus and the sacrifices and the punishments for people not living up to the expectations of the Mosaic law, in the Western world, they've modified that. They had to modify it. But don't underestimate the Old Testament and its requirements. They were absolutely malicious. But the Jewish culture, in its sanity, in its development, modified it. Now, to some degree, the Muslims have done that, but not in the extent that the Jews have, because you'll get the Muslims still committing terrorism unconsciously, because they believe it's what the writings of Islam prescribe, and there's preachers that do encourage it. So it's complicated, really complicated. But you can't be a Muslim in its truest sense without believing in jihad and your necessity to contribute to that.
You that, Michael. Do you think that's what the government are worried about, or do you think they're simply worried about votes and they don't want to offend the Muslim community more broadly?
The latter, clearly. Look, let Joe, seriously. The bottom line here is that Labor are a captive in their branches in Western Sydney. They're full of people of Islamic faith, and that's fine. When we join up people from religions, or ethnic groups, we get accused of ethnic brand stacking or religious brand stacking. No one's been accusing the Labor Party of that, even though we've seen Tony Burke's branches, I think Jason Clare's branches, very heavily Muslim focused, and a number of those electorates, 25 or 30% of them, from an Islamic background, and that's fine. But they certainly have an unprecedented amount of influence on this Labor government, as evidenced by the fact that they issued 3,000 visas to people from Gaza to come to Australia, and Palestinians, under pressure from the Muslim voters in those seats. I think we're the second biggest country in the world in terms of issuing visas to people from Gaza. I mean, why Australia was taking them? We know the reason, because Wong and Albanese and Burke are under massive pressure from Muslim voters in Sydney.
Very good. All right, let's talk about domestic politics. David Littleproud is heading back.
Scott Morrison is calling for stronger and more radical new regulations for extremist Islamic institutions. Speaking at the International Conference on Combating Anti-Semitism, the former Prime Minister suggested governance and regulation of how Islam is practiced. This would include a register of public roles, transparency of teachings and foreign funding, and independent monitoring of safeguarding standards.
Some will seek to characterise my remarks as hostile to Australia's Islamic community. and even multiculturalism itself, trolling out the usual accusations of Islamophobia. To the contrary, I'm advocating reforms that I believe will help religious leaders in our Islamic community keep the wolves from their flock.
Bondi Rabbi Yehoram Ullman was emotional as he told the audience about the lives lost in the December tragedy.
It is a voice that will never be heard again. The attack in Bondi took my beloved son-in-law. It took members of our community, good people.
If Islamic leaders have no interest in addressing radical Islam, then we're left to rely on our government. There's a depressing thought. Within hours of Scott Morrison's speech making the news, Senior Government Minister Pat Conroy was echoing Australian National Imams Council talking points. Or were the Imams echoing Labor talking points? It's hard to know these days.
Why the Liberal Party want to hold almost 1 million Australians responsible for the acts of 2 individuals at Bondi is beyond me. It's another example of them trying to divide Australians.
I'll be kind and call Pat Conroy disingenuous rather than a liar. Scott Morrison was not speaking on behalf of the Liberals. Would that he was. He was speaking in his own private capacity. Scott Morrison was not blaming 1 million Australian Muslims for the acts of 2 individuals. He was saying we need to help 1 million Muslims not have their religion corrupted by extremists. And Scott Morrison was not trying to divide Australians, he was trying to protect Australians. He's not promoting division, he's promoting civilisation, for goodness sake. Here's what I found interesting. Without prompting, Pat Conroy then repeated his rubbish answer all over again, just to make sure everyone heard it. It was clearly a rehearsed line that he was determined to get out.
Why the Liberal Party want to hold almost 1 million Australians responsible for the acts of 2 individuals at Bondi is beyond me. It's another example of them trying to divide Australians.
Conroy falsely accuses Morrison of holding 1 million Muslims responsible for the acts of 2 individuals at Bondi, while forgetting that just last week, his government passed legislation holding 1 million gun owners responsible for the actions of those same 2 individuals. The only honest thing Pat Conroy said in that clip was, and I quote, "It's beyond me." Yes, Mr. Conroy, it does seem to be quite beyond you. And then came this gem.
It's clear that the 2 individuals who have been alleged to have committed the vile act in Bondi followed an extreme perversion of Islam, and we've called that out from the Prime Minister down. But to tar an entire religion, I just think, is unacceptable. It's not based in fact, and it undermines social cohesion.
You don't have to tar Islam. If you know the Islam writings, you are under the obligation to support the jihad. Otherwise, you're not a Muslim. That's all there is to it. You can play games and all the rest of it, but no.
Okay, so Conroy agrees there's a connection between Islam and terrorism. He concedes the Bondi attack was linked to a perversion of Islam. But then he insists we mustn't talk about it because that risks undermining social cohesion. Well, Mr. Conroy, if social cohesion is so flimsy, so fragile, so delicate that we can't even talk about Islam without accusations of Islamophobia, well, I don't think much of your social cohesion. This is a government pretending at social cohesion while practising soft blasphemy laws.
Every Australian should have the right to follow their religion in peace in his country as long as they follow all the laws of the land.
Yes, they should, Mr. Conroy. Yes, they should. Every Australian should also have the right not to be treated like an idiot. Every Australian should have the right to critique religion, including Islam, without being caricatured or labelled divisive. And every Australian should have the right to go to Bondi Beach this weekend confident that they'll make it home. Conroy then had the audacity to say this.
We've passed even stronger hate laws. We would have passed vilification laws if we'd had the support of the coalition. So for now, for Liberal Party politicians, both former and current, the weighing is just incredibly hypocritical and troubling.
You are kidding me. The first thing your government did after passing stronger hate laws was to block a Jew from coming to Australia. And why? Because he had made comments critical of Islam. Scott Morrison should count himself fortunate to have an Australian passport. Otherwise, after his comments last night in Israel, he might not have been allowed home. Welcome to the late stages of Western civilisation. And I'm not joking about that. Have a listen to Treasurer Jim Chalmers when asked about Scott Morrison's speech. Now remember, we've had 15 Australians murdered in an alleged Islamist attack. Scott Morrison suggests we might want to have a conversation about Islam, and this is the Treasurer's response.
Typically, Scott Morrison has a very different objective. He's a pretty divisive figure.
Scott Morrison's divisive for daring to raise the subject of Islam. To be honest, I don't care if Scott Morrison is divisive or not. Is he right? That's the question. But Chalmers won't go near that question because the only thing that scares our leaders more than division is truth. Like I said, welcome to the late stages of Western civilization.
It's the truth, and it's also the loss,
to be honest,
of Islamic boats in Sydney's west. I'll see you on the next one, viewers. Bye for now.